The gallows creaked once in the evening wind, then fell silent. Elias Mercer had spent his last silver dollar on this forsaken stretch of Arizona territory, banking everything on Samuel Kane's promise of peaceful retirement land, no questions asked. The deed crinkled in his vest pocket as he guided his mare through the broken gate past fence posts that leaned like drunken soldiers. His war-weary bones ached for nothing more than a quiet cabin, a working well, and silence that didn't echo with cannon fire. Instead, he found her. The rope stretched taut from the oak's thickest branch, supporting a figure that shouldn't have been breathing but was. Her legs, long as fence rails, kicked weakly against the twilight air. The noose had settled deep into her throat, turning her neck the color of storm clouds. Each breath wheezed out like wind through a broken bellows. Elias had seen hanging before, quick drops that snapped necks clean, merciful in their efficiency. This was something else entirely. This was meant to last. The woman was a giant near 7 feet of raw muscle and desperate strength, slowly surrendering to gravity. Her homespun dress hung in tatters, revealing arms scarred from hard labor and harder treatment. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Wide, pale green and filled not with the vacant stare of the dying, but with sharp intelligence watching his every move. She'd heard his horse. She was waiting to see what he'd choose. The mare snorted, sensing death's proximity. Elias remained mounted, hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. In the distance, buzzards circled lazy spirals against the orange sky. No other soul stirred for miles in any direction. Whatever happened here would stay here. The hanging rope swayed slightly, and with it, the woman's shadow danced across the packed earth like some grotesque marionette. Her lips moved, forming silent words he couldn't catch, but her eyes never left his face. A leather pouch lay, kicked open beneath the tree, its contents scattered. Silver coins caught the dying light alongside torn papers, and a single photograph of a stern-faced man in a suit. The same man who'd sold Elias this land with uncommon haste and sweaty palms. Samuel Kane hadn't just sold him property. He'd sold him a problem with a pulse. The woman's kicks grew weaker. Her chest rose and fell in shorter intervals. Time was bleeding out with the sunset, and Elias Mercer, who'd sworn off playing hero when he'd buried his uniform, found himself reaching for his knife. The blade parted the rope in one clean stroke. She hit the ground like a felled tree limbs sprawling in the dust. Elias dismounted his boots, striking earth still warm from the day's heat. Her chest convulsed as she fought for air that wouldn't come easy. The rope had left its mark, a purple ring that would brand her for weeks. He tilted her head back, checking her airway. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips like a trapped bird. War had taught him field medicine, how to keep the dying alive long enough to die proper. "Breathe slow," he murmured, uncapping his canteen. "Don't fight it." Water trickled past her cracked lips. She coughed, sputtered, then drew in her first full breath since he'd arrived. Her eyes fluttered open, those unsettling pale greens, focusing on his face with startling clarity. "Why?" The word came out as a rasp, barely audible. Elias rocked back on his heels. "Seemed like the thing to do." She struggled to sit up, her massive frame trembling with effort. Even seated in the dirt, she nearly matched his standing height. The rope burns stood out angry and raw against her throat. "Kane," she whispered, one hand touching the wounds, "said I was payment for his debts." The name hit Elias like a mule kick. Samuel Kane, the nervous man who'd practically thrown the deed at him before disappearing into the desert dust. Now he understood the haste, the too good price, the way Kane's eyes had never quite met his during their transaction. "What debts?" Elias asked. The woman pointed toward the cabin with a shaking finger. "Everything. The land, the cattle, the water rights. He borrowed against it all, used my labor as collateral. When the note came due," she touched her throat again. Elias helped her to her feet, surprised by how she leaned into his support, despite outweighing him by 50 pounds. Standing, she towered over him like a pine tree, but moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned early that size drew unwanted attention. "Name's Martha," she said. "Martha Burns." "Elias Mercer." They walked toward the cabin together, her long strides shortened to match his pace. The building looked solid enough, but details told a darker story. Fresh scratches around the door lock. Boot prints too small to be hers, pressed deep into the mud by the well. A wooden cross planted beside the porch, carved with symbols that made his skin crawl. Inside, furniture lay overturned. Dishes scattered across the floor in ceramic shards. The stone fireplace showed signs of recent use, but the ashes held fragments of burned paper and cloth. They came 3 times, Martha said, steadying herself against the doorframe. First for the cattle, then for the equipment. Last time for me. Elias righted a fallen chair, testing its strength before offering it to her. She sank into it gratefully, her breathing still labored, but steadying. Who were they? Garrett Wells and his boys. They hold notes all over the territory. Kane owed them near $2,000. She laughed a bitter sound. Told them I was worth that much in labor. Strong as an ox, twice as dumb. The evening light was fading fast now, painting the cabin's interior in deep shadows. Elias lit an oil lamp, its warm glow revealing more details of the struggle that had taken place here. Bullet holes in the far wall, blood stains on the wooden floor already turned brown with age. You fought them, Martha nodded. Killed one, wounded another. That's when they decided hanging was too good for me. Her hands clenched into fists the size of ham hocks. Kane watched it all, never said a word. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, a sound that raised the hair on Elias's neck. He'd fought through enough nights to know when danger was circling, waiting for weakness to show itself. Wells will be back, Martha said, reading his expression. They always come back. Elias checked his rifle, counting cartridges by touch. 27 rounds plus whatever was in his Colt. Enough for a fight maybe, but not a war. How many men does he run with? 8, sometimes 10. Depends on the job. Martha stood moving to the window to peer out at the darkening landscape. They'll come at dawn. Like to catch folks before they're full awake. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain that might not come. The lamp flame flickered as wind found cracks in the cabin's walls. Elias studied Martha's profile against the glass, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her massive hands remained steady, despite everything she'd endured. You don't have to stay, she said without turning. This ain't your fight. Elias thought about his empty pockets, his tired horse, and the deed that had brought him to this place. He thought about the war, about all the times he'd walked away from other people's troubles, because survival meant knowing when not to get involved. Then he looked at the rope burns on Martha's neck and made his choice. Reckon it is now. Dawn broke gray and hostile with storm clouds pressing low against the desert floor. Elias woke to the sound of horses, their hoofbeats muffled by the approaching weather, but unmistakably deliberate. He counted at least 6 riders moving in formation, like soldiers who'd done this before. Martha was already awake, standing at the window with a shotgun that looked like a child's toy in her massive hands. The rope burns had darkened overnight, forming an ugly necklace of bruised flesh that would mark her for weeks to come. They're coming up the ridge road, she whispered. Garrett's riding point. Elias checked his rifle one last time, working the action smooth and quiet. 27 cartridges felt like 27 too few, but he'd faced worse odds during the war. The trick wasn't having enough bullets. The trick was making every shot count. The riders emerged from the morning mist like phantoms taking solid form. Garrett Wells sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. Tall and lean with silver hair and dead eyes, he wore his reputation like armor. The men flanking him carried themselves with similar arrogance, rifles across their saddles, hands loose and ready. They stopped just outside rifle range, close enough to be heard, but far enough to retreat if things went sideways. Wells cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Morning, stranger. Here tell you cut down something that belonged to us." Elias stepped onto the porch rifle, held casual but ready. Martha remained inside her shotgun, trained on the window. The smart play would be to negotiate to find some middle ground that didn't end in blood. But looking at Wells's cold smile, Elias knew there would be no compromise here. "Don't see anybody's brand on her," he called back. Wells laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Kane signed her over fair and square. Payment on a debt long overdue. You cut her down, you assumed his obligation. Kane's gone. Debt died with him. Kane ain't dead, friend. Saw him in Tucson last week, drinking away what little he had left." Wells spurred his horse a few steps closer. "But that don't change nothing. The woman comes with us, or we take this place apart, board by board, looking for what's owed." Inside the cabin, Martha appeared at a different window, her shotgun now visible to the riders. Several of them shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly remembering their last encounter with her. "She killed Tommy Briggs," one of them called out, caved his head in with a fence post. Wells raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Elias. "That's another debt she owes. One way or another, she's coming with us today." The wind picked up, stirring dust devils across the yard. In the distance, thunder rolled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to darken the ground. The storm was moving in fast, which might work to their advantage if things went bad. "Counteroffer," Elias said, stepping to the edge of the porch. "You boys ride out now, and nobody has to explain any bodies to the territorial marshal." Wells's smile widened, showing teeth yellow as old bone. "Marshall's 3 days' ride from here. Lot can happen in 3 days." That's when Martha made her move. She burst through the cabin's back door like a force of nature, circling wide around the building, while the rider's attention stayed fixed on Elias. Her massive frame moved with surprising silence across the rocky ground, using an old grain shed for cover. Wells was still talking, laying out terms that amounted to surrender or death, when Martha rose up behind his rearmost rider like an avenging angel. Her hands closed around the man's throat before he could cry out. She dragged him from his saddle and dropped him unconscious to the ground in one fluid motion. The remaining riders spun their horses, confusion breaking their formation. That's when Elias opened fire. His first shot took Wells' horse through the chest, sending the animal crashing down and pinning its rider beneath its weight. His second punched through another man's shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. Martha had commandeered the fallen rider's rifle and was laying down steady fire from behind the grain shed. Her shots were well-aimed and patient, each one finding its mark or coming close enough to matter. The fight that followed was sharp and brutal, lasting perhaps 5 minutes, but feeling like hours. The remaining riders tried to charge the cabin, but Martha's crossfire broke their momentum. Rain began falling in earnest, turning the dust to mud and making footing treacherous for the horses. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 riders lay unmoving in the yard. 2 more had fled into the storm, bleeding from wounds that would slow them down considerably. Wells himself sat propped against his dead horse, clutching a shattered leg and glaring at Elias with pure hatred. "This ain't over," he gasped. "Kill me and my boys will burn every ranch from here to Mexico looking for you." Martha emerged from cover, her shotgun trained on Wells's chest. Rain had plastered her hair to her skull, and the rope burns stood out livid against her pale skin. For a moment, Elias thought she might pull the trigger and end it. Instead, she lowered the weapon. "Get him on a horse," she said quietly. "Send him home with a message." They loaded Wells onto one of the surviving mounts, his broken leg roughly splinted with boards torn from the grain shed. He could barely stay upright in the saddle, but he was conscious enough to listen when Martha leaned close to whisper in his ear. "Tell your boys what happened here. Tell them what it costs to try hanging an innocent woman. And tell them if they come back, I won't be so merciful next time." Wells rode out into the storm without another word, followed by the riderless horses of his dead companions. The rain washed their hoof prints away within minutes, leaving no trace of their passage except the bodies in the yard. Elias and Martha stood together on the porch, watching the storm swallow their enemies. The crisis was over, but something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were partners who'd shed blood to defend what was theirs. "Think he'll be back?" Martha asked. Elias studied the horizon where Wells had disappeared. "Maybe, but not anytime soon." Thunder crashed overhead and the rain intensified, drumming against the cabin's roof like bullets. But inside, a fire burned warm and steady, casting light that pushed back the darkness. The storm raged for 3 days, turning the desert into a temporary lake and washing away the last traces of the gunfight. When it finally broke, the landscape had transformed. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, painting the valley floor in brilliant reds and yellows. Creek beds that had been bone dry for months now ran with clear water, carrying the promise of good grazing and better crops. Elias found Martha by the new stream, kneeling in the mud, with her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She'd been working since dawn, building a small dam to redirect water toward the cabin. Her massive hands moved rocks that would have taken 2 ordinary men to lift, positioning them with the precision of someone who understood both engineering and necessity. "Stream's running clear," she called out, not looking up from her work. "Should last through summer if we're careful." He'd been watching her for days now, noting how she moved through the world with a careful awareness of her own strength. Everything she touched required conscious restraint, every gesture calculated to avoid the kind of damage that came naturally to someone her size. It was a kind of perpetual loneliness, he realized, being forever mindful of the space you occupied. "Martha," he said, settling onto a fallen log nearby, "we need to talk about what comes next." She continued working, but he caught the slight tension that entered her shoulders. In the 3 days since the fight, they had established a careful rhythm of shared labor and mutual respect. She cooked breakfast while he tended the horses. He repaired the cabin's damage while she worked on improving the land. Neither had spoken of the future beyond the immediate needs of survival. Kane's still alive, Elias continued, which means those debts are still hanging over this place. Martha finally looked up, mud streaking her face and water dripping from her hair. You thinking of riding out finding him? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Elias had been thinking exactly that, and they both knew it. The smart play was to track down Kane, force him to clear the debts or face the consequences. It would mean leaving Martha alone to defend the ranch, but it would also mean settling the matter permanently. $2,000 is a lot of money, he said carefully. More than this place is worth, that's certain. Martha stood wiping her hands on her skirt. But it ain't really about the money, is it? She was right, and they both knew it. This was about something deeper than debt and obligation. This was about the kind of person you chose to be when everything else was stripped away. There's another option, Martha said, moving to sit beside him on the log. Even seated, she towered over him, but her presence felt protective rather than intimidating. We could make this place profitable. Work together, build something worth defending. Elias studied her profile, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her hands remained steady despite everything she'd endured. You're talking about a partnership. I'm talking about a life, she replied quietly. I've been alone since I was 16 years old. Worked for other people, built their dreams, made them rich while I stayed poor. For once, I'd like to work for something that's mine. The creek babbled softly between its new banks, carrying away the last of the storm's debris. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in grass that grew greener by the day. It was peaceful in a way Elias hadn't experienced since before the war, but peace always came with a price. Wells won't give up, he said. Men like him don't forget. Martha nodded. But next time we'll be ready. Better fortified, better armed, better prepared. She turned to face him directly, her pale green eyes serious. Question is, will you be here for next time? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the valley. Not the hostile thunder of raiders this time, but the steady clip-clop of a single rider moving without urgency. Elias reached for his rifle anyway, old habits dying hard. The rider appeared over the ridge as a dark silhouette against the afternoon sky. As he drew closer, details resolved themselves. An older man, well-dressed but travel-worn, riding a good horse with expensive tack. Most importantly, his hands remained visible and empty, suggesting parley rather than violence. He stopped at the edge of the yard, just close enough to be heard without shouting. Mr. Mercer, my name is Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court. Might I have a word? Elias and Martha exchanged glances. Official visitors usually brought official troubles, and they'd had enough trouble to last several lifetimes. Light down, Judge, Elias called back. Coffee's hot if you're interested. Judge Harrison proved to be a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of careful mannerisms that came from years of handling dangerous situations with diplomacy rather than force. He accepted Martha's offer of coffee with courtly grace, showing none of the unease most men displayed in her presence. I've come about Samuel Kane, the judge said without preamble, and the rather substantial debts he's accumulated throughout the territory. Martha set down her cup with deliberate care. We ain't responsible for Kane's debts, Judge. Actually, Miss Burns, that's precisely what I'm here to discuss. Harrison pulled a leather folder from his saddlebags, extracting several official-looking documents. It seems Mr. Kane used fraudulent papers to secure loans against this property. Papers that claimed you were bound to him through, shall we say, irregular circumstances. Elias leaned forward. What kind of irregular circumstances? The kind that would make such a contract null and void under territorial law. Harrison replied carefully. Mr. Kane claimed to own Miss Burns's labor through a debt bondage arrangement. Such arrangements are illegal in Arizona territory, which means any loans secured by such means are also invalid. The implications hit Martha first. Her massive hands began to tremble, and she set down her coffee cup before it could slip from nerveless fingers. You're saying the debts aren't valid? I'm saying Garrett Wells and his associates have been operating outside the law, Harrison confirmed. Wells has been arrested along with 3 of his men. They're currently awaiting trial in Tucson. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd planned around, had just been swept away by a few official documents and some carefully chosen words. "What about Kane?" Elias asked. "Mr. Kane has also been arrested. He'll be facing charges for fraud, illegal sale of property, and conspiracy. I expect he'll be enjoying the territorial prison's hospitality for quite some time." Martha stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She walked to the window, staring out at the land she'd worked, and bled for the land she'd nearly died defending. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Judge Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "Now, Miss Burns, you're free to make your own choices. The property reverts to its rightful owner, free and clear of any encumbrances. Mr. Mercer's deed is valid, and any improvements you've made—" He gestured around the cabin, taking in the repairs and additions they'd made together. "Well, those speak for themselves." 6 months later, the ranch had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a hardscrabble piece of desert was now a thriving operation, with healthy cattle grazing in green pastures and crops growing strong in carefully tended fields. The cabin itself had been expanded with Martha's addition, providing both privacy and practical workspace. Elias stood on the porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the eastern horizon for the first hints of sunrise. The rope burns on Martha's throat had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. But some scars ran deeper than skin, and he'd learned to recognize the moments when memory crept back to haunt her. This morning was different, though. This morning carried the weight of decision. Martha emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee and moving with the quiet grace that had taken months to develop. Living with another person had taught her new ways of being large in the world, ways that took up space without overwhelming it. "Judge Harrison's riding out today," she said, settling beside him on the bench they'd built together from cottonwood logs. "Bringing those papers you asked about." The papers were adoption documents drawn up in proper legal language that would make Martha his legal heir. It was practical thinking, the kind of planning that protected property and ensured continuity if something happened to him. But it was also something more, and they both knew it. "You don't have to sign," Elias said quietly. "No obligation either way." Martha sipped her coffee, studying the lightening sky. "I've been thinking about names," she said. "Never had much use for mine growing up. Burns was my father's name, and he sold me to Kane when I was barely grown. Figured maybe it was time for a change." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound carrying across the valley like a promise. The ranch was coming alive around them, cattle stirring in their pasture, horses nickering softly in the corral. It was the sound of home, of things built to last. "Martha Mercer," she said, testing the name, "has a nice sound to it." Judge Harrison arrived as promised, bringing official seals and witness signatures that would transform their informal partnership into something recognized by law. But the real ceremony had happened months earlier, in the moment when Elias chose to cut the rope rather than ride away. They signed the papers at the kitchen table, with Martha's precise script contrasting sharply with Elias's hurried scrawl. When it was done, Harrison shook hands with both of them and mounted his horse for the long ride back to town. "What now?" Martha asked, watching the judge disappear over the horizon. Elias looked around the ranch, taking in everything they'd built together. The expanded cabin, the improved pastures, the irrigation system that turned desert into farmland. It was more than he'd dreamed of when he'd spent his last dollar on Kane's discarded property. "Now we keep building," he said. "Keep improving. Keep proving that some things are worth fighting for." Martha nodded, understanding, passing between them without need for words. They'd both been discarded by people who should have protected them. They'd both found their way to this place through circumstance and necessity. But what they'd built here was entirely their own choice. That evening, as the sun set over their land, Elias found Martha working in the vegetable garden, her massive hands moving with surprising delicacy among the tomato plants. The rope scars were invisible in the golden light, and when she looked up at his approach, her smile carried no trace of the fear that had once defined her. "Thinking we might need to expand again next year," she said, gesturing toward the growing abundance around them. "Maybe add on to the house, put in a proper workshop." "Planning ahead," Elias observed. "Planning to stay," she replied, and in those 3 words lay everything that mattered. The western sky burned orange and red, painting the desert in colors that would fade with darkness, but return again with dawn. In the distance, cattle settled for the night, while coyotes began their evening chorus. It was the sound of continuity of life persisting, despite all attempts to destroy it. Elias Mercer had come to Arizona territory looking for peace and found something better. He'd found purpose. And Martha Burns, who'd once hung from a rope as society's discarded refuse, had found the one thing she'd never dared dream of. She'd found home. The gallows still stood beneath the oak tree, but its shadow no longer fell across the yard. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far they'd traveled from that first evening, when choice had mattered more than safety, when cutting a rope had meant the beginning of everything that followed. Some debts they learned could only be paid with loyalty. Some bonds could only be forged in fire. And sometimes justice came not from a judge's gavel or a sheriff's badge, but from one person's decision to see humanity where others saw only burden. In the gathering darkness, two figures sat on their porch, sharing coffee and comfortable silence, while their land breathed peacefully around them. They were no longer the desperate souls who'd found each other by accident 6 months earlier. They were partners, family guardians of something worth defending. The rope had been cut. The choice had been made. Everything that followed was theirs to build.